Like, for example, when 9/11 happened, my first thought was to go to Billy Bragg's website. Like, what does Billy Bragg think about things? And I don't know if we sort of have that musical figure anymore. Who are the punk bands? I don't want to know what Fall Out Boy thinks of Trump.
My name is Ben Charland. You're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My guest this week is Alex Green. He's the host of the Stereo Embers podcast, which features interviews with musicians, authors, artists, and actors talking about the current creative moment in their lives. Alex is also a professor, an author, a music journalist, and he's the editor of Stereo Embers magazine. It's a fascinating conversation that we have about music, the music industry, and this is the first episode that I've recorded since COVID-19 has become a part of our lives. We talk not just about creativity and music during the pandemic, but what it means to be a professor during this time, the pandemic pivot, so to speak. We talk about the future of education during this pandemic and after. We talk about politics and social issues specifically to the United States because that's where Alex is from. He's based in San Francisco. The conversation about race, which he calls long overdue. The issue of ideology becoming identity, and of course, Donald Trump. Now, if you like this episode and if you like this podcast, please give it a rating and a review at Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast provider that you use. You can also go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca, to find all previous episodes, to get in touch with me by email or on social media. Let me know what you think of this episode or any other, and let me know who you think should be on the show in the future and what you think we should be talking about. Also at the website, you can get the show notes for this episode. So those are all of the things that we reference in this conversation, whether it's an artist or a musician. Finally, get in touch with me and let me know what on earth you think is going on. Alex Green, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Ben.
Thank you for being on. It's been a long time since you and I have chatted, but I'm very, very excited to chat with you about music, about the music industry, about podcasting, about your writing, about creativity in general. It's something that you've said recently, actually, which is that if you're being creative, then you're happy. That's kind of your modus operandi, so to speak. And so I want to chat with you about all of those different things. This is also the first time I've had one of these conversations in some time. I did a backlog of conversations before I left Ontario. I moved up to the north of Canada and the Yukon. Oh. And so this is my first time back at it. I kind of developed a backlog and now I'm doing conversations once again. So you're getting me a bit raw and rusty perhaps. And you know, as a podcaster, Alex, just what that's like.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, though, before we kick into podcasting your music or wherever we're going to go, I've got this big question, which is always the same for every guest, and you can take it anywhere you want. It's a broad question for a broad response. We can talk about really anything, but it's a question with that urgency of what on earth is going on. So I've got to ask you, Alex, what on earth is going on?
Things are going really well, Ben. It's a great time to be alive. I don't know. I mean, I ask myself that literally thousands of times a day, because it seems to me that every time I feel like I have a handle on it, it sort of slithers away. And I think that sort of the pandemic is kind of dominating everybody's feeling about what actually is going on. So everything is sort of done through a pandemic lens. And, I'm sure people are sick of talking about it. But for me, really, ultimately, that's kind of the dominating thing. And then there's this kind of long overdue in America conversation about race, which is happening. So there's that. And then we have this complete and utter lunatic running the country. And so you've got that. So there's like these three really sort of intense things happening at once. And then there's, going to be a new Bon Jovi album. So there's a lot to handle. There's a lot going on, Ben.
There is a lot going on.
And,
yeah. And I think the question just becomes more pregnant with time. Every time I ask that question with more time passing, it feels like our age is more in flux, is more uncertain, is more packaged with stuff happening, whether it's Donald Trump or the coronavirus. But you mentioned, music, and not just the Bon Jovi album, but music in general. How is that being affected by COVID-19?
Massively. So when I first started talking to musicians about the coronavirus, for the first 2 or 3 months, they were sort of, I mean, they're all very concerned, and they want everyone to be okay. But creatively, everyone was kind of tickled that they had time to be at home and to be creative and to tend to their craft, And so a lot of them were saying, well, it's business as usual for me. It's, I'm good being creative, and this gives me an opportunity to really focus that creativity into a concentrated space. So they were all okay with it. As the conversation, so I didn't take a break at all. I kept going because everyone was home. So while you were moving, I was talking to everybody because everybody was they're trapped at home, right? So I backlogged like 40 conversations in 30 days. And it was interesting for me to sort of see how the responses started to shift a little bit. And as we got closer and closer to June, mid-June, you could feel the rot setting in. And what I mean by that is not that people weren't feeling creative still, but they were realizing like, oh, I'm not playing live. I'm looking at my bank account. There's no money coming in. I'm looking at all the venues I played closing, right? And I spoke to Tyler from Neon Trees, and he said something I hadn't even thought about, where he was saying when this is over, a lot of bands won't even be around anymore. And I hadn't thought about that. And so seeing the arc of from creativity to financial concern has been tough, but palpable. And I think that a lot of these artists are really worried now about, for example, I spoke to someone from the Whiskey Sour Happy Hour. It's a radio program that she started with Ed Helms from The Office. He's a big bluegrass guy. And she was telling me back in May that they had a meeting scheduled in April of 2021. It's like a kind of a conference or a forum, and they've already canceled it in May for the following year.
Wow.
And that was the moment where I went, oh, like people are going to be in a lot of trouble in the music industry in terms of health benefits, in terms of just general revenue. So I was thinking very narrow. I was thinking like, oh, how do you keep in touch with your fans? And it was like, no, that's totally not even secondary. That's a distant concern in the wake of like, what if you break your hand? What if you don't have any money coming in for the next year or two? So the music industry is in trouble in every aspect.
It's fascinating because, I mean, you're talking about the financial consequences and ramifications of the pandemic, which go across industries, but some would say that there's no harder hit industry than the arts in general, whether it's theater, music, live music, whether it's classical or played by a band in a pub, right? That these are all being hit really, really hard. But you mentioned creativity too. And I bring on a lot of artists onto this podcast, and we talk about creativity quite a bit. And you said that at the beginning, a lot of these artists were tickled. And I would agree with that. To have this time to yourself, which is so often prohibited, whether because we feel we have a social calendar to live up to, or children, or just the schedule of going out to play live music. Then to have this time to really focus on the craft. But I wonder if there, as you said, there's this rot. And I wonder if the rot isn't just financial, but it's creative too, that creativity is about tension and release. It's not just about going into a cabin and writing to yourself for a long time. There's got to be a bringing back out, and that maybe that timeline is exactly 3 or 4 months when June hits and people start to get antsy to get out there.
Yeah, and I think like if you think about like Bon Iver, who to write his record, that his breakthrough album, he went into a cabin for 3 months, didn't talk to anybody, killed a bunch of deer and ate it with his bare hands and wrote this album, and then he came out. But he always knew he was going to be able to come out. And what you're saying is so true, because after a certain period of time, I would imagine that creatively it's going to be stifling, and nobody wants to write a pandemic anthem,
Right. Of course.
like nobody wants to do that. And I think that what could happen is that where does inspiration come from? It comes from the external world, and then feeding it back into the internal world, like an emotion reflected in tranquility, however you want to do it. But if you're just sitting inside all the time, I imagine the work will probably suffer.
That's an interesting concept too, the fact that no one wants to write about this thing that's happening to everybody because it's happening to everybody. You know, if we all want to read a story about someone who experienced, I mean, for example, a traumatic event like the Rwandan genocide or the Holocaust in Germany on the dark side of things, but also the summer of '69 in the United States would have been an interesting time to read about because it wasn't experienced by all of us. But when all of us experience it, the nuance kind of gets flushed down the toilet, or at least we worry that it might. I was reading, a short in the New Yorker from a few weeks ago, which was essentially in the form of notes to the writer of a film script saying, yeah, so you have this meeting in a bar. Can you move it to a Zoom meeting like we're doing right now? Can you actually just have all the characters talk on Zoom all the time? And then by the end of it, you realize the studio has been bought by Zoom and the entire world is just one big Zoom meeting. And I think that there's this
Right.
creeping feeling that we are being dominated by this thing, and therefore it would be nice to escape it, whether to write fantasy or just music about something else for a while, which may be a problem because we're not addressing head-on artistically the issues with which we face every day.
Right. And then it sort of becomes, the rare artist who can do the deep dives and come up with like Dune, like Frank Herbert or Tolkien, or for that matter, even Harry Potter, where somebody can really just sort of do that creative dive and come out with something. For pop music, or for alternative music, I imagine that, you might not even know where that inspiration or that genius comes from, but I imagine that the external surroundings not changing won't be inspiring. I'm not saying you have to go to Prague, to write a great pop song, but I do think you have to live a life. And, it's sort of like one of those things I remember when I was in college, every time a girl broke my heart or something, I would immediately go home and write about it. And it was always a different girl, and the poems were always different. It wasn't the same girl, and it wasn't just, I wasn't Emily Dickinson where I was sort of staying inside the house. It's like I was out there experiencing heartbreak rather than sort of imagining heartbreak.
Right.
And I wonder, I think a lot of artists have a tremendous depth of creativity where they might even crank out 2 or 3 albums. I do think that's possible. I don't think this is playing the long game. I don't think this is going to be very helpful creatively.
You reminded me of a saying that is about writing, which is that imagine it as a triangle. One end is experience, one is technique, one is imagination, and you have to have at least 2 of those 3 to be a good writer, and you have to have all 3 to be a great writer. I'd imagine the same thing applies to music. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the same thing. My favorite writers are musicians. Leonard Cohen, Paul Simon, Tom Waits, Joe Strummer. And those guys are, in my opinion, as great a writers as, Carver, Hemingway, Lawrence. So I think it's exactly the same thing. And I think you're going to start to see, just in terms of, if you're a fan of music and you like to sort of do these kind of autopsies on art, I do think you're going to see the limitations that some artists have. And it's hard for me to imagine someone take Gord Downie, right?
Sure.
I can't imagine that guy ever having a problem in quarantine. I bet that guy would have cranked out 50 albums. He's one of those people. I don't think it would have mattered. I just think there's just a cream of the crop kind of person that has an immense capability for imagination and already lived experience, and it just keeps feeding back and enriching it. There are others, and this is by no means a criticism, but there are others who I just don't think have that. And I think that you're going to see their limitations. And I think they're going to see their limitations as well, which is, it's a scary moment, I think, for an artist to face that.
And I think this isn't just for artists, but the entire economy. Some people have spoken about creative destruction, right? That
Mm-hmm.
this will weed out the businesses and the ideas and the people who shouldn't be doing what they're doing and allow the strong ones to succeed. That's a pretty cold way to look at things. But do you think the music industry has worked like that in the past?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. I think this might just sort of augment it, where it sort of levels the playing field and you can really see who's who.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do. And I just think this is literally going to just kind of just make it even more clear.
Yeah.
But I mean, to be fair, Ben, I mean, I also level that criticism at myself, because for me as a professor in the classroom, I think I'm good. I can teach a class. I've been doing it for a long time. I feel confident. On Zoom, I'm terrible. I mean, I am awful, and I've thought about how to become better, and I have come up with nothing. So my own limitations have become very clear as well, and I'm sorry for any student who's going to have me this fall via Zoom.
I hate to accept the premise of what you're saying, but I have to ask why you think that is. Like, is it because there's something about being in a room full of people that kind of ignites those natural things that we connect with the other people in the room, and body language and the signals that we can't record in a Zoom call? Or is it the warmth of the people in the room, or is it something else?
I mean, it's a little bit of everything. And trust me, the premise is true. I promise you. You and I talking like this is a blast. This is easy. But if there were 20 of you, so the sheer numbers already are daunting, right? Because if I'm talking to you and this is great, you're giving me a response to something, and we're hitting a groove, and then another guy in the other bubble next to you coughs, then he becomes the dominating. Even just that alone, his square becomes bigger, or whatever it is. In a room, the way I've taught has always been like, we read an essay and then we talk about it, and it's sort of like the Harlem Globetrotters, where one person does a trick and then passes the ball and someone else does a trick.
Right.
That can't be done on Zoom, no matter how good you are. And I have not modified my game, and I've tried to do that. I literally have not done the pandemic pivot. I've not innovated. My own self-evaluation is that I realize my real limitations as a instructor. I'm not a good online instructor, and I think there are people who are trained to be, and I was never trained to be. So that's another problem as well. So it's all the things you said plus those things, and it's going to be a rough semester.
It's a perfect storm of things. But, education is another sector that we talk about with creative destruction when we talk about with the pandemic, and we wonder how it's going to change in 5 years. Many people have said that education is the one area where we just didn't change, where everything else was moving along and everything else was shifting and evolving, but education was staying like it was 50 years ago, the laggard that was waiting for some kind of disruption. And here it is. I'm not saying that the disruption is good, but as a professor yourself, how do you see education evolving, I don't know, in the next 5 or 10 years, not just because of the pandemic, but given that the pandemic is accelerating trends that are already in place, where is education going?
I mean, I'm one of the few who doesn't think it's going anywhere good, because I think that at least I'll speak from an American perspective, is that universities have become, I mean, obviously not become, they've been this way, they're businesses. And they have the best sales pitch anyone's ever come up with, besides the fact when you die, you'll go to heaven, is they'll say, put down, this exorbitant amount of money for the 4 best years of your life. And people are like, sure, that sounds great. 4 concurrent great years, I'm in. But that's not really the way it goes. And I think that what's happened is colleges have gone so into being a business that it's gotten in the way of the instruction and the teaching and the organic feel of it. I've watched my own school change over the years, and it's not pretty. And I just think it's become, like, for example, you pay $80,000 a year for a private school in America, and then you go to the bookstore or the whatever, and you buy a $100 sweatshirt, a hoodie, and it's like they couldn't throw that in with the tuition. Like, it's just everything is just micro managed, micro sold, and they can't. They're not even trying to hide it anymore, And so that's gotten in the way, I think, of real learning.
Well, and how they have to compete with each other too. I mean, I've heard stories anecdotally, but I've also read analyses of these things where the way that a university or college has to sell itself to a parent of kids is essentially to say, well, we've got water slides and they're going to be able to have such great time on the weekends, and we're going to do everything we can to make the student experience so powerful and potent. And it just begs the question constantly, well, who cares? I mean, isn't it a school?
Right.
I mean,
Right.
aren't you supposed to be learning there? I mean, that's great that you're having fun, but why has that become so important? And I think you answered it. It's because it's become a consumer product and not just a tool to elevate thinking, to inquire, and to allow people to change their path in life, to do something that requires the mind. And I think that universities have a really wonderful function, but they've, in this business sense, they've lost their way. There's a book called The Coddling of the American Mind. I don't know if you've heard of it. Yeah, it's fascinating. It talks about some of this stuff, but the reason I bring it up is because one thing that it mentions is how the university has become beholden to the student in a way that it never was before. The original universities of the Middle Ages were based around the professor. Essentially, it was a guild of professors getting together to sell their classes to students who wanted to study with them.
Right.
And the university was kind of almost like a union, protecting them and allowing them to charge a standardized fee and so forth. And that evolved in the university we know today. But the problem is that it was never the belief of a university until recently that the student would dictate what they should learn, that the student would dictate how the class should go, and the student should dictate what things require trigger warnings, for example. Now, as universities become, socialized institutions which require some kind of reflection on where we are as a society, they need to change. But shouldn't the change be in the interest of who we think of a higher ideal for a student rather than the base impulse of what a student wants out of their consumer experience? And the book touches on that, but it touches on many other things as well. But it horrified me, having been out of school for some time, about the idea of going back. And
well, they've also stripped the power from the professor. So like, for example, a couple of years ago, like grade inflation is a big thing where you're encouraged not to fail people, en masse. There was a professor in Texas who he was like, I'm going to give people what they actually deserve. And he failed like 93% of the class. And there was a coalition that got him fired. I mean, right. This idea that you are handing people something because they've paid this money. There's this tacit agreement that you will water it down. And then I think another problem in America is, I don't know what it's like in Canada, although I suspect it's not like this, is that everything's done through sports.
Right.
You're talking about college athletes that are nationally televised and have media training. And, I played tennis for my university, and my coach always told me, school is your job, tennis is your luxury. You don't get to play tennis if your grades are not strong. And I'm personally, I know this is not a popular opinion, but I really don't think that college athletics should be aired or televised, or I just think it should be scaled down.
Yeah, it's an experience from a Canadian perspective that seems bizarre from a distance, because I don't know. I'm not a big sports fan, so I can't really say this with a lot of certainty. But from my experience, a university football, hockey, soccer, whatever team is really just kind of like a high school football, soccer, hockey team. They're just a little bit higher level, and maybe you can get a good scholarship because you're a good athlete or you try hard or whatever, but it's really just part of the general experience. There is no what there is in the United States with college basketball or college football, which is sometimes more of the bigger deal than the NFL or the the NHL or whatever. And that, from a Canadian perspective, is what we don't have that here. But, as usual, I think from a Canadian American thing, it's everything you guys have. It's like a little bit less intense here, I guess is the way to say it. Some people interpret that as boring, but No,
I like it. Mike Myers said, Canada is like America without the violence, which I always liked. But, I'm with you. I'm not a big sports fan either. And, but for example, like last year, there was a huge conversation about, should college athletes be able to make money off of their likeness being used for whatever? And I thought, wow, just listen to that conversation, and that tells you right there what the problem is, right? There's a lack of awarding academic recognition, and there's more of a propensity to award athletic endeavors. And these people walk across campus like celebrities, you know, and many of them are because they're on television. And I'm against it. I think all college sports should just be scaled down, and that might help matters because the playing field is just not level. It tips in the favor of the athlete. And you know, I played tennis. We were largely ignored, so I feel I can speak with a little bit of impunity here. But you know, of course, it's important to play sports, but the idea, I think it's really corrupted the model of university life in America from a business and social perspective.
Yeah, there's another book I read recently called Guyland, which is about, you know, the emergence of bro culture in the, you know, 2010s, late 90s kind of thing, which I think is still prevalent today. But one thing I learned in reading that book was how far a university or college will go to get a college athlete to sign on with their college or their university, right?
Yeah,
like
right.
the lengths and the parties that they would throw. Essentially, some universities, colleges have been accused of hiring their students as prostitutes to entice these young men to attend their universities, which was crazy to think of a university acting in that way. But if, again, you think of them as consumer products, it only goes to follow logically that would happen.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, it's corruptive. Right. And it's only gotten worse. And I think that, and the interesting thing is that if you look at the results of, you know, there are people who graduate from college and they're still functionally illiterate. It's like, how did that happen?
Yeah.
You know, but we're seeing a lot of it. So I think in America, especially, a college education does not mean what it used to mean. And I think it's too bad. But I think one of the biggest problems I think would have to be sports. I really do. And then the sort of business model, put those together and you have a real decline in academic endeavors.
To go to something you said at the very beginning about the racial issues that are occurring right now in the United States. And this isn't something that isn't happening in Canada. It's just from a different prism. I think the bigger issue in Canada is the way that we collectively treat Indigenous people. That Indigenous people in Canada have a much higher incarceration rate, much akin to the incarceration rate of African Americans in the United States. So, you know, we still have an issue with how we deal with Black people or Asian people, but the Indigenous issue is probably the sharpest one here. But I wanted to ask this question because we're talking about education and college campuses, so much of the debate, especially in the last 5 years or so, has occurred not just on these campuses, but about these campuses, whether it's the free speech warriors, which is funny because the left used to be the side of free speech, and now it's suddenly the right who are claiming that mantle, rightly or wrongly. But the campuses have become these battlegrounds for these very race issues or inequality issues, economic issues, class issues. And, you know, I understand that you're not an expert in this, but just as an American living in San Francisco, which is definitely a town with many universities, how does this strike you? Yeah.
Well, I'm not an expert, but I can say this. What has emerged to me is that America seems to have a sliding scale of racism, whereas it's not acceptable to make fun of certain races, but it is acceptable to make fun of others, and that has been a huge problem. For example, you know, the president can make a derogatory comment about the coronavirus and refer to it as the Kung flu, and it's business as usual. He can keep saying it comes from China. He's demonizing and weaponizing the illness and its alleged origins. And as a result, antipathy towards the Asian American community has grown, and violent acts against them have grown 200% or something insane like that.
Wow.
You know, he said something along. I'm Jewish, and he said something about I like my, I can't remember how he said it, but he basically was saying like he likes Jewish people, you know, wearing small hats and working on numbers, right? And everyone kind of went, oh, okay, that's right. Now, had he made that, I know it's ridiculous, but had he made that comment about the African American community, it would have been absolutely a ballistic response, and rightfully so. But what I'm saying is that it's sort of like one of those things where when someone says, if someone eats beef and then they get upset that someone eats rabbit, it's like, well, you can't right? You can't. Speciesism is very similar to racism in the sense that you can't just pick and choose who gets to be eaten and who doesn't. And so in America, we had this weird thing where we had this enormous tolerance. Like, for example, years ago, they were saying there's no African Americans being represented at the Academy Awards. And they were right. That was true. But there were also no Asian Americans either. And no one was talking about that. No Native Americans, no Latinos. And nobody was talking about that. And so although I agreed with the premise and I thought, yes, that is true, and we should have that, it's not inclusive. And it seems like we've left a lot of races behind. And so there seems to be a kind of misunderstanding. Like, for example, I like Kristen Bell. I think she's a fine person. And she had a lot to say about what happened with George Floyd, and she made a video about taking responsibility, and I thought that was awesome. But she said nothing about Trump saying the Kung flu. Or you see what I'm saying? So
Totally.
the response has to be equal. Otherwise, it just feels intellectually dishonest to me.
Yeah, it kind of feels like when an environmentalist will try to protect dolphins, but they don't give a damn about tuna. Right. Tuna is going to go the way of the dodo bird pretty quickly, way before dolphins do. Dolphins are doing fine, but dolphins are cute. Dolphins look anthropomorphic, and so we can easily put our own images and minds into the face of a dolphin. But a tuna, that's gross. I'll have tuna on my sandwich, thank you very much, and not feel too guilty about it. It's the same intellectual dishonesty that you're talking about. And it's one of the formative things in my university career was just a fellow student saying something that I'd never thought of before, which was nationalism to him was the same as racism, that they were the same concept applied differently. That when you essentially are carving out a group of people and saying that this group is going to be treated preferentially over this group, even if it's defined by a geographical border. Granted, this is the way the world works today. We are defined by predetermined nations who have rights to determine their own destiny and so forth, but still, we're making the same slicing and dicing as we do with racism, just by a different metric. And by no means am I saying that racism should be equated with this, given slavery in the United States, given the slave trade that happened all over the Western world for so long. But what I am saying is that to be intellectually honest, we have to position it with other things that we're doing at the same time, which could be not equivalent, but very, very similar. And one thing that's happening, and this is happening in Canada too, is how we are dividing ourselves by political party. And one of the great divides today, obviously Democrat, Republican in the United States, Liberal, NDP, Conservative in Canada, but that is becoming less and less how you're going to vote and where you kind of align yourselves on political issues, and more about who you are. If you are a Democrat, you should be able to list out everything else about yourself. You live in the inner cities, you live close to one of the coasts. This is becoming more and more about identity and less about a belief system. Do you find that that's happening too?
I do. Oh, 100%. I really do. And I think, I mentioned being Jewish because I think it's, my people, we've been persecuted throughout history. You should see our persecution LinkedIn profile. It's pretty impressive. People have hated us for a really, really long time. And so anytime I see groups, being persecuted or I feel a solidarity. Like, for example, Trump completely undercut the health benefits of transgendered people. And then he went on to say later on that day, there's no greater friend than me. And I thought, obviously that's a not a very convincing Jedi mind trick, but that kind of stuff for me, it's always been, just go down the line. If it's them, it's going to be somebody else, and then it's going to be somebody else. And I'm in a weird position because I look like a white male, and I am on a job application for sure. But if I went to a white nationalist rally, I'm not the white they're looking for. It's not what they want.
What is it? What would they say? You will not replace them.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Right. So there's nuance to the discussion, and I don't think that playing it out in the media, I don't think that nuance is going to be noticed or discussed or observed in any kind of way. But like, again, I mentioned at the beginning that it's a long overdue conversation about race that we're having, and it's massively important. And, thank God it's happening. I'm so grateful that there's the Black Lives Matter movement, that there is this massive cultural shift. But it's also, racism is an idea, right? And people looking to live in a post-racial world is magical thinking at best. They killed Jesus and Christianity did okay, right? I mean,
yeah.
So I worry sometimes that people are aiming for this kind of post-racial idea, which is probably impossible to achieve. But at least that's why I want more discussion about what we're talking about, because I mean, I think that's how you get your head around it, where, oh yeah, these people are being left out, being marginalized, being ignored. How can we have a post-racial world if you're not even including them in the conversation?
Here's a concept that came up in this conversation so far that surprises me when I think about it. It's the idea of college athletics. As a Canadian, I really don't appreciate how intense this can be in the United States, not just as a sport, but as a whole social phenomenon. That college students can be paid for their likeness to be represented because they are so good at a particular sport. Now, coming up in this conversation, we take a big political turn, but also we talk about the process of creating something, and Alex's point that we shouldn't be talking to artists about what they've done, but what they are currently doing. That's all coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. Yeah, it's so funny when you say that, talking about a post-racial world. For me, for so long, I took that for granted as the future that 99% of us want, where we're blind to color. We're blind to ethnicity, where it doesn't really matter. It's about as important as the color of your eyes or the color of your hair. It's
right.
Irrelevant for the most part. And that was what I just took for granted as being the future that everyone wanted except for the crazy people, right? And the crazy people were all going to die one day and we'd all be fine.
Right.
Until actually I did an episode of this podcast with a professor of social work at Memorial University in Newfoundland. His name is Sulaimon Giwa. He's originally from Africa. He's a gay man. And so he talked a lot about marginalization. But one thing that he said, which was really important and stuck with me for a long time, which is, if you don't see race, you don't see me. And I, up to that point, thought, I don't want to see race. I want to be blind to it. That was, again, the future that I had in mind. And he said, no, in that future, I'm invisible to you. That all of my experiences, all of my ancestors' experiences are wiped out.
Right.
And I don't want that to happen. And I realized in that moment the nuance and complexity, and that my position that I had essentially grown up with was not necessarily wrong, but was simplistic and potentially actually blind to experience and not just to color.
Right. That's so perfect. And there's also, I was watching this video. Sometimes this is the problem with the pandemic. Sometimes you get on YouTube and you start watching like animal rescue videos.
We've all done it. Yeah.
Good God. And there was a whale rescue in Nova Scotia. And they rescued this whale. And they talked to this guy who was just standing on the beach. And they said, what made you want to save this whale? And he said, well, why wouldn't you? Right? Like, why wouldn't you save the whale? And I think that, like, my feeling is, why would you hate somebody for their race? Why would you marginalize someone for their sexual preference? I'm with you in the sense that, like, that's a very simplistic way to think, because people do. And it happens all the time. And not everybody does want the thing that we think is obvious to us.
Yeah.
And then it gets really complex. I mean, you've got people in the Senate right now in the US saying the most vile things. And you're like, you're an elected official. What the hell are you talking about? The president sort of giving license to, inflict violence on Asian Americans, just through his rhetoric. So, I'm very worried about that, especially because I always thought that, like you, I operated under that idea that, like, that was just how everyone thought, but that's not how everyone thinks.
Yeah, and that the people who were fighting were saying, here's where that reality is not being lived up to.
Right.
rather than saying, here is where you are not listening to me and you're not respecting my history. Because the idea, if we just suddenly went colorblind just out of nowhere, well, the dominant paradigm would remain dominant. We haven't fixed it. We haven't equalized it yet, right? And there's so much to this conversation, whether it's about race or politics. And I do want to talk actually about your experience as an American living with Donald Trump over the last 3-4 years. But more importantly, I'm wondering how the music industry has responded. I don't mean to say, like, have you seen more protest songs? I mean to say, like, have musicians felt the need to respond to this? Have you seen a theme or certain themes of emotions rising through music? Or, how has that played out over the last 3-4 years?
That's a great question. I mean, I'm a little bit older than you. And so growing up in the 80s, I'd walk into a record store and all the punk rock albums had caricatures of Reagan. Because Reagan was an absolute, nightmare. He's been sort of lionized and revised, but he was not a good person, and not a good president. Maybe he was a fine person. I didn't hang out with him. But record stores, like, punk rock musicians really went after Reagan. He was sort of he was the guy, and rightfully so. And I think that George Bush got a little bit of that too. I mean, Green Day, American Idiot, there's that whole thing. The problem is that I don't know, like, we don't really have our Woody Guthrie anymore. There's no Phil Ochs. There's no, I mean, even Dylan doesn't really address this kind of stuff. There's no one person who sort of is the one who's going to, like, raise the flag and say, here's how it should be done. It's become so diffuse that I think that, who is our big political, like, I always think, like for example, when 9/11 happened, my first thought was to go to Billy Bragg's website. Like, what does Billy Bragg think about things? And I don't know if we sort of have that musical figure anymore. Who are the punk bands? I don't want to know what Fall Out Boy thinks of Trump. That doesn't interest me at all. I wanted to know what the dead Kennedys thought about Reagan, or it seemed like it meant more. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's a longer conversation. I always feel that this kind of behavior politically kind of activates the activist in music. And I haven't really seen a great voice speaking out against the administration in an interesting artistic way. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, or in a way that just that is a magnet for other people to say, that's what we're trying to say, and that's how we're feeling. I've actually heard an argument about this, and it isn't about music, but all of the arts in general, because we don't seem to have seen what you're saying in any art form, whether it's theater, film. I mean, to some extent comedy, but really all comedians are doing are replaying clips of Donald Trump and laughing at him, right? Which right. Is important, and he's his own satirical machine. But so this is the argument that comes across, which is that he's already doing the work for us, because he's embodying the criticism in his behavior, that Donald Trump is essentially acting out the stupidity and the craziness, and the more crazy he is and he's called out to be, well, he'll just one up it the next day. And so there's no room for someone to come in and provide a sense of shame, because there is no shame and there is no cap on what he's capable of doing. So why would I look to an artist to provide the extreme example when I know that the greater entertainer is Donald Trump, who's going to provide an even better example of his own craziness the next day? And this argument essentially goes to explain why he has gotten away in being the Teflon president, and gotten away with saying to have been the most outlandish president in living memory, at least.
Oh, the worst by far. And I also feel it's dangerous to laugh at him, because I feel that it sort of is distracting from the real damage he's doing. Mm-hmm. So it's been interesting. I've always used comedy as a coping device, but, like, he's not funny to me. And I see people on Facebook or on social media, here comes the orange whatever, and I always feel like, all right. I mean, I get it because it's absurd. I do get it. Here comes the baby whatever. He's like a baby who does this or what, or But I feel that is to sort of be distracted by the distraction. And I feel that like it's dangerous to do that right now, because if he were to win, and I'm not convinced he won't, and it keeps me up at night, then I think that it's the point of no return. And I really don't think that is an exaggeration about what could happen. It's very, very dangerous. And the media is complicit in this kind of, like right now, there's this kind of, Biden has this massive lead. I guarantee you, if we talk in a month, they're going to say it's tightened up. And meanwhile, no one's cast a vote yet. So I don't know what they're talking about. But they sort of have to advance this narrative that it's kind of like a horse race. And, it's not. Polls are polls. But I don't know. I really think he is one of those people that when we give it 5 years, right? Crisis plus time equals humor. Like, give it a little bit of time and it might be funny. But right now it feels too terrifying, because he's responsible for so many people dying of this disease, taking it lightly, being racist, being misogynistic, being intolerant, being hateful, that you go, 4 more years of that, I don't think we can sustain it. I don't think we'll be able to survive.
Well, partly I think because it is exemplifying the divides that already exist and are already tearing people apart. And, any Democrat in the United States would probably much rather live in a city today, and a Republican would much rather live in the country, because that's where your other people are. And that divide, as people get further and further apart physically, which of course is pronounced to a great degree by the pandemic, they have less and less in common with each other. They are allowed to hate each other more, like truly hate. You're no longer an opponent, you're my enemy. And my enemy must be destroyed. And if my enemy wins, then I'd rather start my own country. And I think that this vitriol and hatred is a big part of it. And you're totally right. And, nothing is perfect in Canada. It's a lot of the same crap that's happening, but we do watch from a distance, somewhat of a distance, and say, not only that, how will they get through this, but also how will the democratic traditions and customs survive as well? If the president, for example, does what he suggested he might do, which is not respect the results of his defeat, if he's defeated in November of 2020. And, there are laws and there's a Supreme Court and all this stuff, but we all know that democracy is not just about a piece of paper. It's about the common received customs that we all accept, that there's rules to the game. But if the other half says, I don't buy those rules anymore because the system is rigged and I want my guy to win, well, I'm sorry, but it is possible for the system to collapse if too many people just choose not to believe it anymore. And that is probably the most concerning thing, because I think in 5 years, we will not only be able to laugh at it, but we might even be able to say, God, remember the time when we all hated each other so much? But in 5 years, if you don't have those customs and principles and traditions anymore, those can't be won back.
Right. That's so true. And you're absolutely right. And what worries me is that, when you admire somebody, right? Like, think of like the authors or the musicians or the political figures that you admire. They have exemplary behavior in some way, whether it's on the page or through the speakers or through their behavior in public. And you look at him and you think, like, why is anyone backing this person? Like, there's nothing he does which is elegant or eloquent or, there's no heart in what he does. There's no caring. He's not like a horse you'd feel good backing. Like if I had a kid and they knew I supported him, I'd be embarrassed, And I also wonder how much that has to do with, so a friend of mine grew up in Canada, and she was from Edmonton, and she told me that at the height of Wayne Gretzky's powers, like when he was like the guy, which was probably for a long time, he was in a bar in Edmonton on a day off. This is like in his zenith. Say it's like 84. And she said he was just sitting by himself. And people might walk by and say hi. Nobody asked for autographs. Nobody was bothering him. Nobody wanted a selfie. Or I know we didn't have cell phones back then, but nobody was bothering. Wayne Gretzky could just sit in a bar and drink the day after, destroying a team on the ice, right?
Yeah.
And I wonder if like the American sort of cult of celebrity has finally done us in, because there's something about Trump as a celebrity, which is the reason why he got. I mean, like, I think The Rock could run for president and he might even win, with no political experience, just like Trump. And people were saying, well, Trump ran a business. He'll be a great president. It's like, yeah, but you wouldn't say he ran a great business. He'd be a great surgeon. Like, you wouldn't say that, right?
Yeah, that's right.
But really, what they were saying without knowing they were saying it is that he's someone I've seen as a celebrity, so he automatically gets this weird pass, and I don't think that happens in Canada or in any other part of the world where you just sort of give this kind of carte blanche to someone because they are famous, and that, I think, is what's going to do us in.
I think that, I mean, maybe not to the same extent, but I think that we're experiencing the same kind of mediatized culture in Canada and Europe, all over the world. I think that there's just a sense in the United States where the presidential election is like the biggest show on earth, right? It's a huge deal for anyone in any country. I lived in England during the election of Barack Obama. That was a big deal. Everyone was out in the bars watching it. And it was not only important, and it was somewhat of a presaging of what was to come in the future, but it was an event. And that's why it's about a horse race. And that's why you have TV anchors who are talking about where things are at on the battleground map, because it's a real celebritized reality show, which is not dissimilar from The Apprentice, right? It really isn't that different. And I think that when it comes to the Canadian elections, there definitely is celebrity in that too. Justin Trudeau has been a celebrity for a long time in Canada. It's not the same thing as Donald Trump, but it's definitely what led him to be the prime minister, is the fact that he's the son of the former prime minister, and he's quite good looking and not as well spoken then as he is now, but there was something to say about his charm and looks and hair and all that stuff, right? Which the opposition took and was critical of. But I think that it's not just, going back to 2016, and there were a lot of theories, you remember, in the aftermath of the November election in the United States about what happened, how did this happen?
Yeah.
And one thing that people said was that a lot of people just wanted to take a wrecking ball to the system. They'd been told for so long that it was rigged and corrupt and their vote didn't matter. So why not vote for the horse that you should be ashamed of? Why not vote for the horse that will actually run the other direction and make the entire thing look ridiculous? Because if I deep down believe that it is, that's my guy. And the self-destructive nature of that vote and that idea must be factored into this. And I wonder if it's still there. I don't know.
It's a good question. And I think that what we were hearing here in America was they voted Donald Trump in because people were angry. That's what they kept saying. People were angry. They wanted to take a wrecking ball to the system. You're right. And people were angry. So my feeling, I don't really accept that premise, but let's just say it's true. Then if that were true, then Trump doesn't have a prayer in 2020 because people, I would imagine, are probably angrier now.
Right.
Because we have a virus. We have police brutality well documented. We have people dying every single day. We have, 70,000 people being, diagnosed every day with this illness. We have political unrest. We have, the list goes on. So I would imagine that people are angrier now than they were in 2016, which makes me think if that is actually true, which I don't think it is, then I would think then Trump can't be competitive. But he will. I heard the statistic that when Nixon left office, when Nixon admitted that he was corrupt, right? Mm-hmm. He still had just a shade under 30% approval, leaving office, having already admitted, like 30%. I would have thought it was 3%, and I would think that was still too high.
Well, that, I read a lot about Nixon prior to the impeachment of Donald Trump and, even in the beginning of his presidency, to wonder, like, what will happen with the Mueller report and things like this.
Yes.
And what was fascinating is that it really wasn't, at the end, when he resigned, like you say, he had a lot of support in the Republican Party. And I think that a majority of Republicans still supported him. A majority of the electorate did not. But Republicans were still majority in support of Richard Nixon. Moreover, it was only until the essentially the Gang of Five or the Senate got together and walked over to the White House and said, okay, you're going to have to resign because we will not be able to support you in the incoming conviction proceeding in the Senate, in the trial.
Right.
And so you're finished. You might as well resign and take the high road. But that was because, in a sense, those guys knew that they had to vote somewhat by their conscience. And when the evidence came out, they wouldn't be able to do what senators did just less than a year ago in the United States and voted to acquit. Because it wasn't about the evidence. It was purely political. The process was entirely politicized and driven down party lines.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so now with these people who have supported him with Trump, I mean, it'll be interesting to see who starts walking back. I mean, I think with 100 days to go, it's too late. It's sort of like you go down with the ship. But I do think that you might see a walk back or two, but I don't think anything more than that.
So I just got my second to last question for you, Alex, which is about conversation and podcasting. And I wonder how important the conversation is in this time of flux, in this crazy period that we're living right now, whether it's through a podcast or through an actual in-person dialogue. How important is it for coming up with solutions, but also how important is it for just letting off some of this steam? Or is it just our way of coping?
Yeah. I think it's good for you and I think that I think it's what we do. And for me, all the conversations are forming this larger narrative about creativity, and which I'm really interested in. I'm really a novice political, not pundit. I'm sort of a just observer. But ultimately, my real interest is in that conversation about creativity and the current. My show is predicated on the idea of what does the current creative moment look like for you. I don't want to talk about the past. I want to talk about what's happening right now. And I have found it really useful. I love what musicians are saying to me about their process and what they're doing and how they're handling it and how they observe their past and how it informs their future and how they move forward and how they evolve. It's been really interesting. And I think it's been good for them too, to sort of have this conversation about themselves. I noticed something, Ben, when I started interviewing bands when I was 15. And I noticed something, that musicians would always come in to talk about their new album. And I noticed that a lot of them wanted to talk about the album they hadn't even recorded yet, right? Like the one that they were cooking up. And it occurred to me 20 years too late, but it occurred to me like, oh, the conversation about the thing that you haven't created yet is, to a creative person, far more interesting than what they've already created, right?
Yeah, of course.
And so I've found that these conversations have been really, I think, very beneficial in terms of understanding that process, hearing about something as it's being concocted. Then you sort of add in the lockdown. I've noticed that a lot of people are, A, very accessible, which has been great because they're home. B, they seem to want to talk, and they seem to want to sort of not diagnose, but examine the current condition. And like I said, I've watched it change. It's shifted quite a bit. And I think dialogue is always useful. So in answer to your question, I think yes, very, very useful. And ultimately, I mean, I don't think it's like a healing thing, but it is part of the process of getting your head around who you are and how you create in the time that you're living.
There might be something there on a larger scale. Like, you like to ask people, okay, what are you working on now? Where do you want to go with this? Where's your creativity taking you beyond where you are currently standing, or beyond the past? And I wonder if there's a way to reframe that into a political question, or reframe that into a question for not just a politician, but to an observer or a pundit or someone who's working in these streams, and say, all right, I understand the legislation that you've created. I understand what you're trying to do. And I understand even the election that you're trying to win. Forget that. Yeah. Where do you impulsively want to go? Like, where do you see the world in 5 years? And not in terms of your plan, your jobs plan, or your methods for dealing with unemployment or the pandemic, but what do you see it looking like in 5 years? And in it as a creative question, not just an analytical question.
Yeah.
I don't know. I wonder if that would unlock something in our political discourse.
I think it would. I think it would bring in, it would sort of angle the conversation towards that kind of thinking. I think it'd be very useful.
Yeah. Alex, I've got my last question for you, which is just a simple one. If you and I had another hour to chat and we had one more thing to talk about, what would that one thing that we didn't get to today, what would that one thing be?
We didn't hit that Bon Jovi album, and I think it's very important to
there you go.
Break it down, Ben. By the way, I don't even know if there really is going to be, I just thought it'd be a funny thing to say. I don't know if there really is a Bon Jovi.
Oh, really? I was getting all excited.
No, don't get excited. I mean, do we need another one?
I don't know. I'm not a Bon Jovi fan, but
I'm not either.
I mean, I like some of his songs, but yeah.
I would rather have a Loverboy album than a Bon Jovi album.
Right. Yeah.
I'm keeping it Canadian, Ben. I'm keeping it all Canadian today.
Hey, there's a lot of Canadian music out there. And we are proud. We're proud of it.
You should be.
Yeah, you mentioned Gord Downie, but yeah. Alex, it was so great to chat with you. This was a wonderful conversation, and thank you so much for taking the time.
Hey, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I'd love to come back.
No problem. Okay, well, we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, buddy.
To learn more about Alex Green, go to the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes, as well as a way to get in touch with me by email or on social media. Let me know what you think of this episode, about any other, and who you think we should have on this podcast in the future, and what you think we should be talking about. Now, your quote of the week is from Billy Bragg, someone that Alex mentioned in this episode, and it doesn't really have to do with anything in particular. I just thought it was a really fascinating line. It goes, "He was trapped in a haircut he no longer believed in." Thanks, as always, to our composer Andrea Wetstein for this wonderful music, and special thanks to Alex Green for joining me on Zoom for this conversation. One other thing, this is episode number 98. For episode number 100, we're going to do something quite special. Check it out on social media to learn more. I'll see you then.